The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of Jake Morrison's ranch, turning the dried grass into brittle straw that crunched under his worn boots. He stood on his sagging porch, looking out at land that had once been green and fertile but now stretched before him like a brown ocean of despair. The drought had lasted 3 years, longer than anyone could remember, and it was slowly killing everything he had worked 20 years to build. Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead with a sleeve that had seen too many washings. At 42, he looked older than his years, with deep lines carved around his eyes from squinting against the sun and worry etched into every feature of his weathered face. His hands, calloused and scarred from countless hours of hard work, trembled slightly as he counted the cattle in the distance. 15 head left. Last spring, he had owned over 200. The bank letter in his pocket felt heavier than the rocks he had hauled to build his fence lines. 3 months behind on the mortgage, and William Hartwell, the banker, had made it clear that patience was running thin. Business is business, Morrison, Hartwell had said just yesterday, his soft hands never having known real work. I can't make exceptions, even for old friends. Old friends. Jake almost laughed at the bitter irony. They had grown up together in this town, but while Jake had chosen the hard life of ranching, Hartwell had stayed safe behind his mahogany desk, growing fat on other people's struggles. Now that same friend held the power to take away everything Jake had built with his own hands. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Jake look up from his dark thoughts. A cloud of dust rose in the distance, and he could make out a single rider coming fast across the prairie. In these parts, someone riding that hard usually meant trouble, and Jake had enough trouble already. He stepped down from the porch and walked toward the approaching rider, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 on his hip. The rider was a young man, maybe 25, with the lean build of someone who lived in the saddle. His clothes were dusty from hard travel, and his horse was lathered with sweat. Jake recognized him as Tommy Carson, one of the hand from the Broken Arrow spread about 30 miles south. Tommy pulled up his mount in a spray of dust and dirt. "Mr. Morrison," Tommy gasped, fighting to catch his breath. "You got to help. There's been a massacre on the old freight road, about 5 miles south of Devil's Canyon. Wagon train got hit real bad." Jake felt his stomach tighten. Indian raids have been rare in recent years, but desperate times made desperate people of everyone, red and white alike. "How many?" he asked. "Don't know for sure," Tommy replied, shaking his head. "Maybe 6, 7 wagons. Looks like they were heading east, probably trying to get out before winter. But someone hit them hard. Bodies everywhere." The young man's face had gone pale beneath his tan. "Mr. Caldwell sent me to round up help. We need every man we can get to bury the dead proper and see if there's any survivors." Jake looked back at his ranch, at the work that needed doing, at the cattle that needed what little care he could give them. He thought about the bank letter in his pocket and the bills stacking up on his kitchen table like autumn leaves. Every hour away from his place was an hour he couldn't afford to lose. But then he thought about families caught on the road, about children who might be lying hurt and scared among the wreckage of their homes on wheels. A man didn't turn his back on something like that, no matter how desperate his own situation might be. That wasn't the way he had been raised, and it wasn't the kind of man he wanted to be. "Give me 5 minutes," Jake said. "I'll get my rifle and some supplies." Inside his small ranch house, Jake moved quickly. He grabbed his Winchester rifle and a box of ammunition, stuffed some jerky and hardtack in his saddlebags, and filled his canteens with water. As he worked, his eyes fell on the framed photograph sitting on his kitchen table. His wife, Sarah, smiled back at him, frozen in time from their wedding day 15 years ago. She had died in the influenza epidemic that swept through the territory 8 years back, taking with her not just his heart, but his hopes for children and a full family to work the land alongside him. "I know what you'd say," he whispered to the photograph. "Help first, worry about ourselves later." Sarah had always been like that, putting others before herself, believing that doing right would somehow make things work out in the end. Jake wasn't so sure about that anymore. but her voice still echoed in his decisions. He saddled his horse Buck, a sturdy bay gelding that had been his companion for 6 years. Buck wasn't fast, but he was reliable and strong, qualities Jake valued above almost anything else. As they rode out with Tommy, Jake couldn't help but look back at his ranch one more time. The weathered buildings seemed even more fragile in the morning light, as if a strong wind might blow them away like tumbleweeds. The ride to Devil's Canyon took them across some of the most unforgiving country in the territory. The land here was broken and harsh, filled with deep ravines and rocky outcroppings that could hide an army. It was the kind of country that attracted outlaws and desperate men far from the reach of law and civilization. As they rode, Tommy filled in more details about the discovery. Peters and me were driving a small herd to market when we smelled the smoke, Tommy explained. Followed it and found the wagon still burning. Whoever did this wasn't in any hurry. They took their time. His young face hardened with anger and disgust. Wasn't Indians, Mr. Morrison. This was white men's work, and they wanted folks to know it. Jake nodded grimly. Indian raids were usually quick and efficient, focused on stealing horses and supplies. This sounded like something else entirely, something meaner and more calculated. Outlaw gangs have been growing bolder in recent months, taking advantage of the fact that most of the territorial law enforcement was spread thin across hundreds of miles of empty land. As they approached Devil's Canyon, the smell of smoke became stronger, mixed with other odors that made Jake's stomach turn. He had seen death before, both in the war and on the frontier, but it never got easier. The human cost of violence always seemed to hit him harder as he got older, maybe because he understood better how precious and fragile life really was. They topped a small rise and saw the scene spread out below them in the shallow valley. 7 wagons sat in a rough circle, their canvas covers burned away and their wooden frames blackened by fire. Bodies lay scattered around the camp, and Jake could see that Tommy had been right about this being white men's work. The attack had been thorough and brutal, designed not just to steal but to send a message. Several other men had already arrived and were moving carefully through the wreckage. Jake recognized Bill Caldwell, the owner of the Broken Arrow, and a few of his hands. There was also Doc Williams from town, his black bag in hand as he moved from body to body, checking for any signs of life among the victims. Jake dismounted and approached Caldwell, a big man with gray hair and the bearing of someone used to giving orders. "Bill," he said with a nod, "how bad is it?" Caldwell's face was grim as he gestured toward the wagons. 17 dead so far, including women and children. Looks like they hit just before dawn when most folks would still be sleeping. The bastards took their time about it too, from what we can tell. Jake walked slowly through the camp, taking in the details. Scattered belongings lay everywhere, rifled through and discarded when they proved worthless to the attackers. A child's doll lay in the dirt near one of the wagons, its painted face staring sightlessly at the sky. Near another wagon, Jake found a family Bible with pages torn out and scattered by the wind. "Any idea who did this?" Jake asked. "Could be anyone," Caldwell replied. "There's at least 3 gangs working this part of the territory. Could be the Garrett boys, or maybe that bunch that's been hitting stages up north. Hell, could be a new group entirely. Times like these bring out the worst in some folks." Doc Williams approached them, wiping his hands on a blood-stained cloth. "Found something strange," he said in his quiet voice. "Tracks leading away from here head in 2 different directions. Most of the horses went north, toward the Badlands. But there's signs that at least 1 person, maybe 2, went south on foot." Jake studied the doctor's weathered face. "Survivors." "Could be," Williams said. "Or could be someone from the gang doubled back for something they forgot. Either way, those tracks are maybe 6, 7 hours old. If it's survivors, they got a good head start, but they're on foot in bad country." Caldwell spat in the dirt and adjusted his hat. "We got our hands full here with the burying. Can't spare men to go chasing ghosts through the desert." Jake looked south toward the broken country that stretched away toward the mountains. If there were survivors out there, they were probably hurt, scared, and without supplies. In this heat, without water, they wouldn't last more than a day or two at most. And if they were being hunted by the same men who had done this massacre, they might not even have that long. He thought again about his ranch, about the cattle that needed tending and the bills that needed paying. He thought about the bank letter in his pocket and William Hartwell's soft hands counting out his final days as a landowner. Every practical instinct told him to stay here, help with the burial, and then get back to his own problems. But then he looked at the child's doll lying in the dirt, and he heard Sarah's voice in his memory, telling him that doing right was more important than doing easy. "I'll go," Jake said quietly. Caldwell looked at him in surprise. "Jake, you sure about that? This could be a wild goose chase, and you got your own troubles to worry about." "Someone has to look," Jake replied, checking his rifle and adjusting his saddlebags. "If there's folks out there hurt and scared, they need help now, not after we finish here." Doc Williams nodded approvingly. "If you find anyone, bring them to my office in town. I'll have supplies ready." Jake mounted Buck and turned south, following the faint tracks that Doc Williams had pointed out. As he rode away from the massacre site, he could hear the sound of shovels biting into hard ground as the grim work of burial began. Soon even that sound faded, leaving him alone with the vast silence of the desert and the weight of his decision. The tracks were hard to follow, partially obscured by wind and time, but Jake had learned tracking during his time as a young man working for the cavalry. He could make out the signs, disturbed stones, a thread caught on a thorny bush, the faint impression of a boot heel in a patch of soft earth. Whoever had made these tracks was moving carefully but not expertly, trying to cover their trail, but not really knowing how. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became oppressive. Jake stopped periodically to rest Buck and to study the trail more carefully. The tracks seemed to be following a rough line toward a series of low hills about 10 miles south of the massacre site. It was rough country, full of gullies and rock formations that could provide shelter, but also hide dangers. By midday, Jake had covered about 6 miles, and the tracks were becoming fresher. He could see where the person or persons he was following had stopped to rest, could tell from the depth of the impressions that they were tiring. There were also signs that worried him, drops of what looked like blood on rocks, and a piece of torn fabric that might have come from a dress. The country ahead grew rougher as Jake approached the foothills. Deep arroyos cut through the landscape like scars, and massive boulders created a maze of potential hiding places. It was the kind of terrain where someone could easily get lost or trapped, especially someone unfamiliar with the area and possibly hurt. Jake was studying a particularly clear footprint in a patch of sand when he heard it, a sound that was almost lost in the whisper of wind through the rocks. It might have been nothing, just the call of a bird or the movement of some small animal. But to Jake's experienced ears, it sounded like something else entirely. It sounded like someone crying. Jake dismounted and led Buck quietly through the rocks, following the sound that had caught his attention. The crying grew clearer as he moved deeper into the maze of boulders and narrow passages that cut through the hillside. It was definitely human, and from the pitch, it sounded like a woman or possibly a young person. The sound was weak and intermittent, as if whoever was making it was trying to stay quiet but couldn't quite manage it. Moving carefully to avoid making noise with his spurs or equipment, Jake worked his way around a large outcropping of red sandstone. The crying seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead, hidden among the shadows cast by the towering rocks. He paused and listened, trying to pinpoint the exact location. The sound was coming from a narrow cleft between two massive boulders, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Jake approached the opening slowly, his hand resting on his pistol grip. He had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving on the frontier, and what seemed like a victim in need might actually be bait for an ambush. Outlaws had been known to use women and children as decoys to lure good Samaritans into traps. But the crying sounded genuine, full of real pain and exhaustion. "Hello," Jake called softly. "Is someone there? I'm here to help." The crying stopped immediately, replaced by a tense silence that stretched for several heartbeats. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, came a reply, "Please don't hurt me. I don't have anything valuable." Jake's heart clenched at the fear in that voice. It was definitely a woman, and she sounded young and terrified. "Ma'am, I'm not here to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice gentle and steady. "My name is Jake Morrison. I'm a rancher from north of here. We found your wagon train this morning and came looking for survivors." Another silence, then, Are you alone?" "Yes, ma'am. Just me and my horse. I'm going to come closer now, real slow and easy. Don't be afraid." Jake edged around the boulder and peered into the narrow cleft. In the shadows, he could make out a figure huddled against the back wall of the natural shelter. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he could see it was indeed a young woman, probably in her early 20s, with dark hair and wearing what had once been a nice traveling dress. The dress was now torn and dirty, stained with dust and what looked like blood. She was pressing herself back against the rock wall as if she could somehow disappear into it, and her eyes were wide with terror. Even in the poor light, Jake could see that she was hurt. Her left arm was cradled against her body, and there was a cut on her forehead that had bled down the side of her face. "It's all right," Jake said, crouching down to make himself seem less threatening. "You're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" The woman studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Finally, in a voice still shaky with fear, she said, "Elizabeth. Elizabeth Harper." There was a slight hesitation before the last name, but Jake was too focused on her injuries to notice. "Well, Miss Harper, you're hurt pretty bad. Let me help you get out of here and somewhere safe where we can tend to those wounds." Elizabeth shook her head frantically. "No, they might come back. They said they'd hunt down anyone who ran. They might be watching." Jake's blood ran cold. "Who said that, Miss Harper? Did you see the men who attacked your train?" "3 of them," Elizabeth whispered, her voice breaking. "They came back after the killing was done, looking for anyone who might have gotten away. I heard one of them say they tracked down any survivors and finished the job, so they couldn't leave witnesses." This information changed everything. Jake had assumed he was on a rescue mission, but if Elizabeth was right, they might both be in immediate danger. He looked back toward the entrance to the shelter, suddenly very aware of how exposed they were. If the killers were indeed tracking survivors, they could arrive at any moment. "How long ago was this?" Jake asked. "I don't know," Elizabeth replied, tears starting to flow again. "Maybe a few hours? I've been hiding here since just after sunup. I've been so scared, and I don't know what to do. Everyone else is their all." "I know," Jake said gently. "I'm sorry for your loss. But right now, we need to get you somewhere safer. Can you walk?" Elizabeth tried to stand, but immediately slumped back against the rock wall with a gasp of pain. "My ankle," she said. "I think it's twisted. And my arm hurts something terrible." Jake could see that her left arm was indeed injured, possibly broken from the way she was holding it. And if her ankle was hurt, getting her to safety was going to be much more complicated than he had hoped. They couldn't stay here, but moving an injured woman across rough country while potentially being hunted by killers was going to be extremely dangerous. "Miss Harper," Jake said, "I need to take a look at those injuries. Is that all right?" She nodded reluctantly, and Jake moved closer. In the better light, he could see that her arm was badly bruised, but probably not broken. The cut on her head was shallow, but had bled freely, as head wounds do. Her ankle was swollen, but she could move her toes, which was a good sign. As Jake examined her injuries, Elizabeth spoke in a small voice. "They killed everyone, even the children. There was a little boy, couldn't have been more than 5 years old. They shot him down like he was an animal." Her voice broke completely. "What kind of men do such things?" Jake's jaw tightened with anger, but he kept his voice calm. "Bad men, Miss Harper. But they're not going to get you. I promise you that." He helped her sit up straighter and offered her water from his canteen. She drank gratefully and Some color returned to her pale cheeks. "Thank you," she said. "I thought I was going to die out here." "You're not going to die," Jake said firmly. "But we need to get moving. If those men are really hunting survivors, this isn't a safe place to stay." Elizabeth looked at him with something approaching hope for the first time. "Where can we go? I don't know this country at all. We were just passing through, heading east to—" She stopped herself, and Jake noticed the hesitation again. There was something she wasn't telling him, but that could wait. Right now, the important thing was getting her to safety. "There's a line shack about 3 miles from here," Jake said. "It belongs to a friend of mine, but nobody's using it this time of year. We can hole up there while we decide what to do next. But it's going to be a hard trip with your ankle hurt." "I can make it," Elizabeth said with more determination than Jake expected. "I have to make it." Jake helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight. She was taller than he had first thought, probably about 5 feet 6 inches, with an elegant bearing that seemed out of place in her current bedraggled state. Even dirty and hurt, there was something refined about her, something that spoke of good breeding and education. They made their way slowly out of the shelter, with Elizabeth leaning heavily on Jake's arm. Buck stood patiently where Jake had left him, cropping at some sparse grass growing between the rocks. Jake helped Elizabeth mount the horse, then took the reins and began leading them through the rocky terrain. The going was slow and difficult. Jake had to pick their route carefully, staying among the rocks and boulders to avoid being seen from a distance, while still making progress toward the line shack. Elizabeth held on grimly, biting back gasps of pain when Buck stumbled or when emotion jarred her injured arm. As they traveled, Jake found himself stealing glances at his companion. Despite her current state, Elizabeth Harper was clearly a beautiful woman. Her features were delicate but strong, with high cheekbones and expressive dark eyes. Her hands, though dirty and scraped, were soft and well-kept, the hands of someone who had never done hard manual labor. Her speech, when she wasn't crying or terrified, carried the refined accent of someone with education and breeding. What was a woman like this doing on a wagon train heading east through dangerous country? Most of the people who took that route were poor families looking for cheaper land or running from something. Elizabeth Harper didn't seem to fit that pattern at all. About an hour into their journey, Jake called a halt to rest both Buck and Elizabeth. They were in a sheltered spot among some large boulders, with good visibility in all directions. Jake helped Elizabeth down from the horse and gave her more water. "Miss Harper," Jake said carefully, "can you tell me about your wagon train? Were you traveling with family?" Elizabeth's face clouded over, and she was quiet for a long moment. My uncle," she said finally. "Uncle Thomas. He was taking me east to—" Again, she hesitated. "To stay with relatives. But he's dead now. They're all dead." There was something in her voice that told Jake she was holding back important information. But he had known enough traumatized people to understand that sometimes the truth came out slowly, in pieces, as the shock wore off. "What about your parents?" Jake asked gently. "Dead," Elizabeth said flatly. "Both of them. That's why I was going to live with my relatives." Jake nodded sympathetically. "I'm sorry. That's a lot of loss for someone so young." They rested for a few more minutes, and then Jake helped Elizabeth back onto Buck. As they continued their slow journey toward the line shack, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to Elizabeth Harper's story than she was telling him. But whatever secrets she might be keeping, his job right now was to get her to safety. Everything else could wait. The sun was starting to sink toward the western mountains when they finally reached the line shack. It was a small, rough building made of logs and adobe, designed to shelter cowboys during winter months when they were tending cattle in the remote areas of the range. The shack belonged to Sam Patterson, whose spread bordered Jake's land to the south. Sam was a good neighbor and wouldn't mind Jake using the shelter in an emergency like this. Jake helped Elizabeth down from Buck and supported her as they approached the building. The door was secured with a simple wooden latch, and inside, the shack was spartanly furnished with 2 narrow bunks, a small table, and a stone fireplace. There were some basic supplies on shelves: canned goods, coffee, blankets, and a few medical supplies including bandages and a bottle of whiskey. "It's not much," Jake said as he helped Elizabeth to one of the bunks, "but it's shelter, and we'll be safe here tonight." Elizabeth sank onto the bunk with obvious relief. "It's wonderful," she said. "I never thought a roof and walls could feel so good." Jake busied himself getting a fire started in the fireplace and heating water to clean Elizabeth's wounds. As the warmth began to fill the small space, Elizabeth seemed to relax for the first time since he had found her. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "I want to thank you for saving me. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come." Jake looked up from the fire. "Any decent man would have done the same thing." "No," Elizabeth said, shaking her head. "Not any man would risk his life for a stranger. You didn't have to come looking for survivors. You could have stayed safe with the others." Jake didn't know what to say to that, so he focused on preparing the medical supplies. But as he worked, he found himself wondering about this mysterious young woman who had dropped into his life at a time when he had troubles enough of his own. Whatever her story was, taking care of her was going to complicate his already desperate situation considerably. But as he looked at her sitting there in the firelight, hurt and vulnerable but still maintaining her dignity, Jake knew he had made the right choice. Some things mattered more than money or land or even survival itself. Sarah had taught him that, and it was a lesson he wasn't about to forget now. Jake spent the next hour carefully tending to Elizabeth's injuries. He cleaned the cut on her head with warm water and bandaged it properly, then examined her swollen ankle more thoroughly. It was badly sprained, but not broken, which meant she would be able to walk on it in a day or two if they were careful. Her arm was more concerning. The bruising was severe, running from her shoulder to her wrist, and she winced whenever she tried to move it. Jake fashioned a sling from one of the torn pieces of her dress, which helped support the weight and ease her pain. "You're going to be all right," Jake told her as he finished the bandaging. "Nothing that won't heal with time and rest." Elizabeth managed a weak smile. "You're very kind, and skilled too. Have you done this before?" "Some," Jake replied. "You learn to patch people up when you live far from doctors. And I spent some time in the war when I was younger. Saw my share of hurt folks." As the evening wore on, Jake prepared a simple meal from the supplies in the shack. Beans and hardtack weren't much, but it was hot food, and Elizabeth ate gratefully. The color was returning to her cheeks, and she seemed more like herself as the shock of the day's events began to fade. "Mr. Morrison," Elizabeth said as they finished eating, "can you tell me about this area? I mean, are we safe here?" "Really safe?" Jake considered how much truth to tell her. The fact was, they weren't completely safe anywhere in this remote country, especially if killers were actively hunting survivors of the massacre. But frightening her more than she already was wouldn't help anything. "Safe enough for tonight," he said. "This shack is well hidden, and anyone tracking us would have a hard time finding it in the dark. We'll stay put until morning, then decide what to do next." Elizabeth nodded, but Jake could see the worry in her eyes. "What happens tomorrow? I mean, I don't have anywhere to go. Everyone I was traveling with is dead, and I don't know a soul in this territory." Jake poured himself a cup of coffee and stared into the fire. That was the question he had been dreading. The smart thing, the practical thing, would be to take Elizabeth to town in the morning and turn her over to Doc Williams or the sheriff. Let someone else worry about what happened to her after that. But something about that plan didn't sit right with him. Elizabeth was clearly not the typical frontier woman. Her clothes, her speech, her bearing all suggested she came from a world of comfort and privilege. Dropping her off in a rough frontier town with no money and no connection seemed like abandoning her to a fate that might be only slightly better than what she had already escaped. "Where are you headed when you join the wagon train?" Jake asked. Elizabeth hesitated, and Jake saw that guarded look come into her eyes again. "St. Louis," she said finally. "I have relatives there who were expecting me." "Well then," Jake said, "we'll have to figure out how to get you to St. Louis safely." Elizabeth looked at him in surprise. "You would do that? Help me get there." Jake felt a strange tightness in his chest as he looked at her. in the firelight, with her hair loose around her shoulders and her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Elizabeth Harper was quite possibly the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. But it wasn't just her beauty that drew him. There was something about her courage, the way she had survived the massacre and then endured the hard journey to safety without complaint, that spoke to something deep inside him. "I'll help you however I can," he said. "Though I have to warn you, I'm not exactly in the best position to be helping anyone right now. My ranch is failing, and I've got creditors breathing down my neck. But we'll figure something out." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "Why are you telling me this? About your troubles, I mean." Jake shrugged. "Seemed only fair. You're trusting me with your life. Least I can do is be honest about what kind of help I can actually provide. Most men would try to impress a woman, not tell her about their failures," Elizabeth said softly. "I'm not most men, I guess," Jake replied. "Never been much good at pretending to be something I'm not." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind whistle around the corners of the shack and the crackling of the fire. Finally, Elizabeth spoke again. "Mr. Morrison, Jake, can I ask you something personal?" "I suppose. Are you married? Do you have a family?" Jake felt the familiar ache that always came with thoughts of Sarah. "I was married. My wife died 8 years ago in the influenza epidemic. No children." "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said gently. "That must have been very difficult." "It was." Jake stood up and walked to the small window, looking out at the star-filled sky. "Sometimes I think about what she would say if she could see me now. The ranch falling apart, me barely hanging on by my fingernails. She always believed things would work out if you just kept trying to do right by people. She sounded like a wise woman." "She was." Jake turned back to Elizabeth. "She would have liked you, I think. She always had a soft spot for folks in trouble." Elizabeth smiled, and for the first time since he had found her, it reached her eyes. "I wish I could have met her." As the night deepened, Jake made up a bed for himself on the floor near the fireplace, giving Elizabeth privacy on one of the bunks. But sleep was slow in coming. He lay awake listening to her quiet breathing and thinking about the complications her presence in his life was going to create. Taking care of Elizabeth was going to cost time and money he couldn't afford to spend. It would mean trips to town, possibly traveling to St. Louis, certainly neglecting his ranch at a time when every day counted. The practical voice in his head told him he was being a fool, that he should focus on saving what little he had left instead of taking on someone else's problems. But every time he considered taking her to town and walking away, he thought about the trust he had seen in her eyes when she had finally agreed to leave her hiding place with him. She was alone in the world, vulnerable and afraid, and she was counting on him. How could he turn his back on that? Jake was finally drifting off to sleep when he heard it, the sound of horses moving slowly through the rocks outside. He was instantly alert, his hand moving to his pistol as he listened intently. The sounds were faint, but they were definitely there. At least 2 horses, maybe 3, picking their way carefully through the darkness. Jake eased over to where Elizabeth lay sleeping and gently shook her shoulder. She came awake instantly, her eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" she whispered. "Someone's outside," Jake replied quietly. "Could be nothing, but we need to be ready." Elizabeth sat up on the bunk, her face pale in the dying firelight. Jake moved to the window and peered out carefully, but the darkness was too complete to make out anything clearly. The sounds had stopped, which somehow made things even more ominous. "Should we run?" Elizabeth whispered. Jake shook his head. "If they're out there watching, we'd be sitting ducks in the open. Better to stay put and see what develops." They waited in tense silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, cutting through the stillness of the night, came a voice from outside. "We know you're in there. Come out now, and maybe we'll make it quick." Jake's blood ran cold. Elizabeth grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. These had to be the same men who had massacred the wagon train, and somehow they had tracked them to the line shack. "What do we do?" Elizabeth breathed. Jake checked his rifle and pistol, making sure both weapons were loaded and ready. "We fight," he said grimly. "It's the only chance we have." The voice outside called again, closer this time. "We ain't got all night. Send out the woman, and maybe we'll let you right away." Jake positioned himself near the window where he could see out while staying in cover. "How many men did you see at the massacre?" he asked Elizabeth quietly. "3 that came back looking for survivors," she replied. "But there might have been more with the main group." "We got you surrounded," the voice shouted. "No way out. Make this easy on yourselves." Jake knew that was probably a bluff. In reality, it would take a lot of men to completely surround a shack, and outlaws usually prefer to travel in small groups to avoid attention. More likely, there were 2 or 3 men out there trying to make him think the odds were worse than they actually were. A shot rang out, and the window above Jake's head exploded in a shower of glass. Elizabeth screamed and threw herself flat on the bunk. More shots followed, punching holes in the wooden walls of the shack and sending splinters flying. Jake waited for a lull in the shooting, then fired back through the broken window, aiming at the muzzle flashes he had seen in the darkness. He heard a curse and the sound of someone scrambling for cover, which told him his shot had come close. "That all you got?" the voice called out, but Jake thought he detected a note of uncertainty now. "We can wait here all night. Sooner or later you got to come out." But Jake knew they couldn't wait all night. The men outside would eventually work up the nerve to rush the shack, or they might decide to burn them out. Either way, he and Elizabeth would be trapped with nowhere to run. Jake made a quick decision. "Elizabeth," he said urgently, "there's a back window in this place. It's small, but you might be able to squeeze through. If you can get to my horse, you could get away." Elizabeth shook her head fiercely. "I'm not leaving you." "You have to," Jake insisted. "This is your only chance." Before Elizabeth could respond, another volley of shots shattered the remaining glass in the front window and punched new holes in the walls. Jake fired back, but he was running low on ammunition, and the men outside seemed to be getting bolder. That was when Jake heard it, the sound of more horses approaching from the south. His heart sank as he realized the outlaws might have reinforcements coming. But then he heard something that made his pulse quicken with hope. "Hello, the shack," called a new voice. "This is Sheriff Tom Bradley. Anyone in there hurt?" Jake's relief was overwhelming. "Sheriff, there's 2 of us in here, and we're pinned down by the men who hit the wagon train." What happened next was a confused blur of shouting, gunfire, and the thunder of horses. Jake heard the sheriff's men engaging the outlaws, shots echoing off the rock walls of the canyon. The battle was brief but intense, and when it was over, an eerie silence settled over the area. "All clear in there," the sheriff called. "You folks can come out now." Jake helped Elizabeth to her feet, and they carefully made their way to the door. Outside, Sheriff Bradley and 3 deputies were standing over the bodies of 2 men, while a 3rd outlaw sat on the ground with his hands tied, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder. "You folks all right?" the sheriff asked as Jake and Elizabeth emerged from the shack. "We're fine, thanks to you," Jake replied. "How did you know where to find us?" "Bill Caldwell sent word about the massacre," Bradley explained. "We've been tracking these bastards for 3 days. When we lost their trail, we started checking every line shack and cabin in the area. Lucky for you we did." Elizabeth sagged against Jake, the relief and exhaustion finally catching up with her. "Is it over?" she asked weakly. Sheriff Bradley looked at the captured outlaw with grim satisfaction. "It is now, miss. These are the last of the Garrett gang. Territory's going to be a lot safer with them gone." As the dawn light began to creep over the mountains, Jake helped Elizabeth onto his horse for the trip back to town. The nightmare was over, but as they rode away from the line shack, Jake realized that his real problems were just beginning. He still had a failing ranch, creditors demanding payment, and now he had the added complication of figuring out what to do about Elizabeth Harper. But as he looked at her riding beside him, safe and alive despite everything that had happened, Jake found that he wasn't thinking about his problems at all. He was thinking about how empty his life had been before she had come into it, and wondering what it would be like when she inevitably left to return to her own world. The thought of losing her so soon after finding her made his chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with the growing realization that Elizabeth Harper was becoming much more important to him than just another person in need of help. The ride back to town took most of the morning, with Sheriff Bradley and his men escorting the prisoner while Jake rode alongside Elizabeth. She seemed stronger now that the immediate danger had passed, sitting straighter in the saddle and taking more interest in the country around them. But Jake noticed she still favored her injured arm and winced when Buck stepped into holes or stumbled on loose rocks. As they crested the final hill before town, Elizabeth pulled up her horse and looked down at the collection of buildings spread out in the valley below. Cedar Falls wasn't much to look at, just a main street lined with wooden buildings, a few side streets with houses, and the inevitable collection of corrals and outbuildings that marked any frontier settlement. But to Elizabeth, who had been expecting to die alone in the wilderness just 24 hours earlier, it must have looked like paradise. "It's smaller than I expected," she said to Jake. "Most things out here are," Jake replied. "But it's home, and the people are mostly good folks. Doc Williams will want to check those injuries properly, and Mrs. Patterson runs a boarding house where you can get cleaned up and rest." Elizabeth nodded, but Jake saw something troubled in her expression. "Jake," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something important about who I really am." Jake felt his stomach tighten. He had been expecting this conversation, had known from the beginning that Elizabeth Harper was keeping secrets. But now that the moment had arrived, he wasn't sure he wanted to hear what she had to say. "All right," he said simply. Elizabeth took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for a difficult confession. "My name really is Elizabeth, but my last name isn't Harper. It's Worthington. Elizabeth Worthington." The name hit Jake like a physical blow. Everyone in the territory knew the Worthington name. They were Eastern industrialists, owners of mining companies, railroads, and cattle operations that stretched across half the continent. If Elizabeth was a Worthington, then she wasn't just wealthy, she was one of the richest women in America. "I don't understand," Jake said, his mind struggling to process this information. "What were you doing on a frontier wagon train?" Elizabeth's face flushed with embarrassment. "I was running away from an arranged marriage my father had set up with a man I despise. A business arrangement, really, to merge two family fortunes. I disguised myself and joined a wagon train, planning to lose myself in the territories until I could figure out what to do with my life." Jake stared at her, trying to reconcile this revelation with the frightened, vulnerable woman he had rescued. "And your uncle? The one you said was killed in the massacre?" "Thomas Harper was one of my father's business associates who was helping me escape. He had a daughter about my age who had died of consumption last winter. He thought if I took her identity, I could disappear for a while until my father came to his senses about the marriage." The implications of what she was telling him began to sink in. Elizabeth wasn't just wealthy, she was missing wealthy. By now, her father would have every Pinkerton detective and federal marshal in the territory looking for her. And Jake, by helping her, had unknowingly made himself part of a kidnapping in the eyes of the law. "Elizabeth," Jake said carefully, "do you have any idea what this means? Your father is probably offering a fortune for information about where you are. Every bounty hunter and lawman in 3 territories is going to be looking for you." Elizabeth's face went pale. "I didn't think about that. I was so focused on getting away from the marriage that I didn't consider what would happen after. And then the massacre happened, and I thought I was going to die, and I just wanted someone to help me." Jake looked down at the town below them, his mind racing. Everything had just become infinitely more complicated. If he took Elizabeth into town, word would spread quickly about who she was. Within days, maybe hours, Cedar Falls would be crawling with people looking to collect the reward that was undoubtedly being offered for her return. But if he didn't take her to town, if he tried to hide her, he would be making himself an accessory to whatever charges her father might bring. Jake had enough problems without adding federal warrants to the list. "What do you want to do?" Jake asked. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the town where people were going about their daily business, unaware that one of the richest women in America was sitting on a horse just outside their community. "I want to go home with you," she said finally. "To your ranch. At least for a few days, until I can figure out what to do next." Jake's heart lurched at her words, but his practical mind immediately began listing all the reasons why that was impossible. "Elizabeth, that's not a good idea. If someone recognizes you, if word gets out that I'm harboring you, I could end up in prison. And my ranch isn't exactly set up for entertaining visitors. It's just a small house, and I'm barely hanging on to the place as it is." "I don't care about comfort," Elizabeth said earnestly. "And I don't care if your ranch is small. It's better than being forced into a marriage with a man who only wants my father's money. Please, Jake. I'll work, I'll earn my keep. I know I'm asking a lot, but you're the only person I trust." The word trust hit Jake harder than any argument she could have made. This woman, who could have any man in America, who had wealth and power beyond his imagining, was asking him to risk everything to help her. And the truth was, despite all the logical reasons to walk away, Jake found himself wanting to say yes. "If I do this," Jake said slowly, "there are going to be conditions. You'll have to stay out of sight, which means staying on the ranch. No trips to town, no contact with anyone. And if the situation gets too dangerous, if I think we're about to be discovered, you'll have to go. I won't go to prison for anyone." Elizabeth's face lit up with hope. "I agree to everything. And, Jake, I can help you financially. I have access to accounts that my father doesn't know about. I could pay off your debts, save your ranch." Jake felt his jaw clench. "I don't want your money, Elizabeth. If I help you, it's because it's the right thing to do, not because I'm looking to profit from it." Elizabeth looked stung by his sharp tone. "I didn't mean to insult you. I just thought, if I'm going to be causing you trouble, maybe I could make it worth your while. Some things can't be bought," Jake said, his voice softening. "My help is one of them." They rode into town in thoughtful silence, both of them aware that they had just made a decision that could change both of their lives forever. Sheriff Bradley was already at the jail with his prisoner, and a small crowd had gathered to hear about the capture of the Garrett gang. Jake guided Elizabeth around the edge of town, avoiding the main street where too many people might get a good look at her. At Doc Williams' office, Jake helped Elizabeth down from her horse and supported her as they went inside. The doctor was a small, neat man in his 60s who had been patching up frontier injuries for more than 30 years. He took one look at Elizabeth and immediately ushered her into his examination room. "Young lady's been through quite an ordeal," Doc Williams said as he began unwinding the bandages Jake had applied. "Head wounds healing nicely, though. You did good work here, Jake. Where'd you learn field medicine?" "Army," Jake replied briefly. Doc Williams nodded as he examined Elizabeth's arm more thoroughly. "Bad bruising, but no broken bones. You'll be sore for a week or two, but nothing permanent. Ankle sprain pretty good, though. You'll need to stay off it as much as possible for the next few days." "I'll make sure she rests," Jake said. The doctor looked at him curiously. "Where's she staying?" "Mrs. Patterson's place." Jake felt Elizabeth's eyes on him, waiting to see what he would say. This was the moment of decision, the point of no return. Once he lied to Doc Williams, he would be committed to the path they had chosen. "She's coming out to my place for a while," Jake said, "until she's fully recovered." Doc Williams raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment. In frontier communities, people minded their own business unless directly asked for opinions. "Well, she'll need proper rest and good food. And keep those bandages clean and dry." As they left the doctor's office, Jake bought supplies at the general store. Food, medicine, and some women's clothes that would fit Elizabeth better than her torn traveling dress. The storekeeper, Mr. Henley, was curious about Jake's companion, but Jake introduced her only as Miss Harper and kept the conversation brief. The ride to Jake's ranch took 2 hours, and by the time they arrived, Elizabeth was clearly exhausted. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the crisis was finally wearing off, and the reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. Jake's ranch house was exactly as he had described it: small, simple, and showing the effects of years of hard times. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. There were 2 bedrooms, one of which Jake had been using for storage since Sarah's death. "It's not much," Jake said as he helped Elizabeth inside, "but it's clean and it's safe." Elizabeth looked around the modest interior, taking in the simple furniture and the framed photograph of Sarah on the kitchen table. "It's perfect," she said. "Thank you for bringing me here." Jake spent the evening cleaning out the spare bedroom and making it habitable for Elizabeth. As he worked, he found himself thinking about the enormous risk he was taking. If Elizabeth Worthington was discovered on his property, it wouldn't just mean financial ruin. It could mean years in prison, the end of everything he had worked for. But every time doubt crept in, he looked at Elizabeth sitting by the fireplace, finally beginning to relax for the first time since he had found her. She belonged here somehow, filled a space in his life that had been empty for so long he had forgotten it existed. Whether that feeling was worth the risk remained to be seen. As they prepared for bed, Elizabeth caught Jake's arm gently. "I know this is dangerous for you," she said, "and I know you think I'm just a spoiled rich girl who's going to bring you nothing but trouble. But I want you to know that I've never felt safer anywhere than I do right here." Jake looked in her dark eyes and felt something shift inside his chest. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we'll start figuring out how to keep you hidden until this all blows over." But as Jake lay in his own bed that night, listening to the familiar sounds of his ranch, he couldn't shake the feeling that nothing was ever going to blow over. Elizabeth Worthington had entered his life like a force of nature, and he suspected that when the dust finally settled, neither of them would be the same people they had been before the massacre brought them together. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods along the creek, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. Normal sounds of a normal night on a frontier ranch. But Jake knew that his normal life had just come to an end, replaced by something much more dangerous, and, if he was honest with himself, much more alive than anything he had experienced since Sarah's death. Jake woke before dawn, as was his habit, but found himself lying in bed listening for sound from the spare room where Elizabeth was sleeping. The events of the past few days felt like a dream, and part of him wondered if he would discover that he had imagined the whole thing. But when he finally got up and looked out the kitchen window, he could see Buck in the corral next to his own horse, confirmation that everything had really happened. He started coffee and began preparing breakfast, trying to move quietly so as not to wake Elizabeth. She needed the rest, and he needed time to think about what they were going to do. Hiding a missing heiress on a failing ranch was not a situation covered in any manual he had ever read. The sound of riders approaching made Jake freeze in the middle of scrambling eggs. It was barely 7 in the morning, too early for social calls, and Jake's ranch was far enough off the main roads that casual visitors were rare. He moved to the window and peered out carefully, his hand instinctively moving toward his rifle. 3 riders were coming up the track toward his house, and Jake's heart sank when he recognized them. William Hartwell, the banker, was in the lead, his soft face set in determined lines. Behind him rode Marcus Webb, one of the territory's federal marshals, and a third man Jake didn't recognize, but who had the look of a professional tracker or bounty hunter. Jake's blood turned to ice water. Had they somehow already discovered Elizabeth's identity? Was this the end before it had even begun? "Elizabeth," Jake called softly toward the spare room. "Get up and get dressed. We have visitors coming, and they can't know you're here." Elizabeth appeared in the doorway almost instantly, fully dressed in one of the simple dresses Jake had bought for her in town. Her dark hair was pinned back severely, and without the elaborate styling she was probably used to, she looked like any frontier woman. "Who is it?" she asked. "The banker and a federal marshal," Jake replied grimly. "Listen to me carefully. If they ask about you, you're Mary Harper, Thomas Harper's niece, and you're here because you have nowhere else to go after the massacre. Can you remember that?" Elizabeth nodded, though Jake could see fear creeping into her eyes. "What if they recognize me?" "They won't. Jake said with more confidence than he felt. "You look completely different from any society photographs they might have seen. Just stay calm, and let me do the talking." The riders pulled up in front of the house, and Jake stepped out onto the porch with what he hoped was a casual expression. "Morning, gentlemen," he said. "You're out early today." William Hartwell dismounted, his expensive suit looking out of place against the rough backdrop of the ranch. "Morning, Jake. Sorry to bother you, but we're here on official business." Marshall Webb was a tall, lean man with gray hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. He touched his hat brim politely. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Marshall Webb, and this is Mr. Dalton from the Pinkerton Detective Agency. We're investigating the disappearance of a young woman, and we're checking with everyone who might have information." Jake kept his expression neutral. "I heard about the Wagon Train massacre. Terrible business. But I don't know anything about a missing woman beyond what Sheriff Bradley told me about the survivors we found." Dalton, the Pinkerton man, stepped forward. He was younger than the marshal, with sharp eyes and the soft hands of someone who made his living with his brain rather than his back. "Mr. Morrison, we have reason to believe that Miss Elizabeth Worthington, daughter of railroad magnate James Worthington, may have been traveling with that wagon train under an assumed name." "Never heard of her," Jake said truthfully. "Like I told the marshal, all I know about is what happened when I went looking for survivors." Hartwell cleared his throat importantly. "Jake, Mr. Worthington is offering a substantial reward for information leading to his daughter's safe return. $50,000. Jake felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. $50,000 was more money than he would see in 10 lifetimes of ranching. It was enough to pay off his debts, buy new cattle, fix every building on his property, and still have enough left over to live comfortably for the rest of his life. "That's a lot of money," Jake said carefully. "Indeed it is," Dalton said, studying Jake's face intently. "The kind of money that could solve a lot of problems for a man in difficult circumstances." The threat was subtle but clear. They knew about Jake's financial troubles, and they were testing to see if greed might make him more cooperative. Jake forced himself to meet Dalton's gaze steadily. "Wish I could help you," Jake said. "But, like I said, I don't know anything about any missing heiress." Marshall Webb stepped forward. "Mind if we look around, Mr. Morrison? Just to be thorough." Jake's mouth went dry, but he nodded. "Course not, though I don't know what you expect to find." As the three men began walking around the ranch buildings, Jake caught a glimpse of Elizabeth through the kitchen window. She had positioned herself where she could hear the conversation, but couldn't be seen from outside. Her face was pale, but she looked calm and in control. The search was thorough, but not invasive. The men checked the barn, the corral, and the other outbuildings, but they didn't actually enter the house. Jake got the impression they were going through the motions rather than expecting to find anything. "Mr. Morrison," Dalton said as they completed their circuit of the buildings, "I should mention that harboring Miss Worthington, even unknowingly, could be considered kidnapping under federal law. The penalties for such a crime are quite severe." "I understand," Jake replied. "But since I've never seen this woman, I don't think that's something I need to worry about." Hartwell mounted his horse and looked down at Jake with undisguised contempt. "You know, Jake, this might be your last chance to solve your money problems the easy way. I'll be back next week for the mortgage payment, and if you don't have it, I'll have it," Jake said flatly. As the three men rode away, Jake stood on his porch until they were completely out of sight. Only then did he allow himself to release the breath he had been holding. Elizabeth appeared beside him, her face drawn with worry. "They know," she said quietly. "They know I was on that wagon train." "They suspect," Jay corrected. "But suspecting and knowing are two different things. Still, this changes everything. We can't stay here much longer. They'll be back, and next time they might not be so polite about searching." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. "That man, the banker. You owe him money." "I owe him everything," Jake said bitterly. "The ranch, the house, probably my soul by now. And the reward money would solve all your problems." Jake turned to look at her, seeing something in her expression that made his chest tighten. "Elizabeth, if you're asking whether I'm tempted, The answer is yes. I'd be a fool not to be tempted by $50,000. But if you're asking whether I'm going to turn you in, the answer is no. Why? Elizabeth asked simply. Jake struggled to find words for feelings he didn't fully understand himself. Because some things are worth more than money. Because you trusted me when you had no reason to. Because... He stopped, unable to finish the thought. Because what? Because I care about you, Jake said quietly. More than I should, more than is smart, but I do. Elizabeth stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell the soap she had used to wash her hair. Jake Morrison, you are the most honorable man I have ever met. Before Jake could respond, Elizabeth rose on her toes and kissed him softly on the lips. It was a brief kiss, gentle and sweet, but it sent electricity through Jake's entire body. When she pulled away, her dark eyes were bright with unshed tears. I care about you too, she whispered, and that's why I can't let you throw your life away for me. Jake felt a chill of premonition. What do you mean? I mean I have to leave. Tonight. If I stay, they'll eventually find me, and when they do, they'll destroy you. I won't let that happen. Elizabeth, no. We can figure something else out. We could go somewhere else, somewhere they won't think to look. Elizabeth shook her head sadly. Where? They have the resources of the federal government and the Pinkerton Agency. They'll never stop looking, and eventually they'll find us. And when they do, you'll go to prison for kidnapping while I go back to my comfortable cage. Jake grabbed her shoulders gently. Then, what do you want to do? You can't just wander around the territory by yourself. It's too dangerous. I'll go to Mexico, Elizabeth said. Start over with a new name, a new life. It's not ideal, but it's better than the alternatives. Not by yourself. You won't, Jake said firmly. If you're determined to run, then I'm going with you. Elizabeth stared at him in shock. You can't do that. You'd be giving up everything. Your ranch, your life here, everything you've worked for. What life? Jake asked. A failing ranch I'm about to lose anyway. Bills I can't pay, and a future that looks bleaker every day. Elizabeth, I lost everything that really mattered to me when Sarah died. This place has been more like a prison than a home ever since. But Mexico, you don't know anything about Mexico. I know enough. I know they don't extradite people for kidnapping charges, and I know that whatever life we could build there would be better than what we'd have apart. Elizabeth was quiet for a long time, and Jake could see her struggling with the decision. Finally, she looked up at him with determination in her eyes. If we do this, if we really do this, there's no going back. Once we cross that border, we can never return to the United States. Are you sure you're willing to give up everything for me? Jake thought about his ranch, about the life he had built with Sarah and tried to maintain in her memory. He thought about the community he had been part of for 20 years, the friends he would never see again, the grave where Sarah was buried that he would never be able to visit. Then he looked at Elizabeth, at this remarkable woman who had come into his life when he needed her most, who had made him feel alive again for the first time in 8 years. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. I'm sure, he said. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Jake and Elizabeth prepared for their escape. Jake sold his remaining cattle to a neighboring rancher for whatever cash he could get, claiming he needed quick money to pay debts. He packed only what they could carry on horseback: food, water, ammunition, and a few precious keepsakes, including Sarah's photograph. As they prepared to leave the ranch forever, Elizabeth found Jake standing in the kitchen, looking at the photograph of his dead wife. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. "I keep thinking I should feel guilty," Jake said, "like I'm betraying her memory by leaving." Elizabeth moved to stand beside him, looking down at the image of the young woman who had been Jake's first love. "Tell me about her." "She was kind," Jake said, "and brave and stubborn, and she believed that everything happened for a reason. She used to say that God put people in each other's paths when they needed each other most. She sounds wonderful." She was. Jake picked up the photograph and carefully wrapped it in cloth before tucking it into his saddlebag. "And she would tell me that life is for the living, and that love is too precious to waste." As they mounted their horses and rode away from the ranch under cover of darkness, Jake looked back only once. The small house where he had known both the greatest happiness and the deepest sorrow of his life disappeared into the shadows, taking with it one chapter of his story. But ahead lay Mexico and freedom and the chance to build something new with a woman who had shown him that his heart was not as dead as he had thought. It would not be an easy life, and they would face challenges neither of them could imagine. But they would face them together, and somehow that made all the difference. 3 days later, William Hartwell arrived at the ranch to collect his mortgage payment and found the buildings empty and abandoned. A note left on the kitchen table simply said, "Gone to start over. The ranch is yours now. G. Morrison." It would be months before anyone connected Jake Morrison's disappearance with the missing heiress, and by then, Jake and Elizabeth would be long gone, lost somewhere in the vast expanse of Mexico, where they would build a new life under new names, bound together by love and the shared knowledge that some risks are worth taking when the alternative is a life without meaning. In the end, Jake Morrison had lost everything he owned, but gained something far more valuable: a second chance at love and happiness with a woman brave enough to risk everything for freedom, and generous enough to accept the love of a desperate rancher who had proven that nobility comes not from birth or wealth, but from the courage to do what's right when everything is on the line.